Hello, and welcome to all the truth seekers that have joined us today from around the world. I'm glad that you decided to join this online learning community. For the next hour, I want to help you uncover new ideas that will push you towards new thinking inside and outside of your business. My name is Mark McKelsey, and I lead the people and the projects that bring you education, trends, and next practices from Global Market Development Center. This Infocast aspires to make your lunch hour profitable by demonstrating just how the curiosity and the power of the consumer must be at the center of all of your strategy. In other words, the way you've done things in the past is not the way your future success will happen. Retailers and brands alike, more than ever before, can be adaptive, must be adaptive in the constant flux in order to connect with your customers. So how do you respond to this session will determine that success. Without further ado, I'm coming to you live from Toronto and have Colorado Springs, and have Mark Ravi joining me today from Planet Retail in Boston. The title of today's session is Online Grocery and the Impact of the Physical Store. Today's Infocast is going to help you find the so what behind the past 2 years of disruption that grocery has been experiencing with a constant influx of tough competitors that are fighting for space in the world of food retailing. While the role of the store changes and departments undergo dramatic transformations, the importance of understanding the shopper is paramount. Retailers struggle today to find ways to mirror the e-com experience throughout the entire store and offer consumers what they want, where they want it. The hardest strategy to execute is about right pricing. How can brick and mortar stores compete against the digital algorithms that change every 15 minutes and constantly scours the global pricing, both virtually and physically, to ensure that online is always offering the best value offered anywhere? That certainly is a tall order for grocery stores. And some retailers may even say it's impossible to compete on pricing today. What was once Walmart's mantra is no longer what consumers are saying they want. Pricing is not the be-all or end-all in driving loyalty today. Convenience and experience is today's new economic advantage in the buying-selling world. Shopper adoption of online groceries in the midst of exponential rise as millennial generations have started shopping for newly formed families and retailers to roll out e-commerce experiences and capabilities. In today's session, we'll forecast the dollar growth expected over the next 5 years and outline which retailers are set up to capture the majority of that growth. We will also examine the impact of the physical store as fulfillment capabilities take a greater role in store-level operations. With that said, welcome, Mark. Would you help our viewers understand a little bit more what some of the key takeaways will be today?
Thanks, Mark. Today, we will be talking about the online grocery landscape. So first, we'll take an overall look at what this looks like in terms of who's leading, who are the market leaders, and where do we see, and who will be the market leaders in 2022. From there, we'll take a look at some of the top drivers that are actually behind this acceleration of the online grocery shift. And then lastly, we will get into what some of the best retailers are doing to react to this shift, along with how this will impact the future brick and mortar stores and how retailers will work to create a true omni-channel experience with both the online and physical store piece.
Thanks, Mark. Before we get started and dive in, I'd like to remind our viewers that we can take questions during or after the session simply by using the Q&A button at the top or the bottom of your screen. We'll get to those certainly at the end of this hour. So let's get started. Back over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. So looking at the online grocery landscape, it's really important to make sure that we take a full look at, yes, the online piece, but as well as the physical store. But before I get right into that, I just want to introduce myself. I am Mark Ravi. I work with Planet Retail R&G as a research analyst on our advisory team. I specialize in online grocery as well as logistics and supply chain for numerous categories. So without further ado, we'll jump into online grocery and its impact on the physical store. So for those of you that have seen a Planet Retail R&G presentation before, whether in person or on GMDC in the past, we outline the future of retail by categorizing drivers into 5 major categories. These categories then shape our assumptions of the future and what that future landscape will be like. Based on that image of the future landscape, we can come up with implications for strategic decisions for both brands and retailers. And once we realized what those decisions were and how this new retail landscape would impact those decisions, we developed 4 winning strategies to center your business around moving forward. So when we take an overall look at the landscape, e-commerce is the big elephant in growth and is growing almost 3 times faster than many of the traditional food-relevant brick-and-mortar stores. So as we see e-commerce take a bigger and bigger share of total sales, it's important to remember that this doesn't necessarily mean that all that e-commerce growth is coming within grocery or within a food-relevant channel, which is why we have to look at e-commerce out and how it impacts each specific category. So for grocery, it has historically been a very laggard category online, with just 2 to 3% of share currently 2 to 3% of sales currently moving through online platforms. Now, while it is in its infancy, you can see that we do expect it to grow significantly faster than some of the key categories that were some of the first to shift online. But as we evaluate the growth of e-commerce, we have to remember that this is a fundamental shift in how we look at retail. Historically, we'd always looked to organic growth coming from the opening of new stores and the expansion, gaining market share through physical expansion. But as this competition intensifies, organic growth is not as easy to come by as it used to be. And as you can see, we only have very few retailers, generally within the discount section, that are projected to open stores over the next 5 years. It's also important to note that the stores that are opening are not the traditional big box stores that we generally see within grocery and within food relevance. It's extremely important to note that what we are seeing is more of these small format stores that will be challenged for space as retailers try to correctly calibrate what assortment should be in store and what should shift to completely online. So as we try to get a better understanding of this, it's important to remember that big box faces greater pressure than these small players. Similarly, we're going to take a look at the bigger and larger piece of the grocery industry. So when we take a look at the US grocery landscape as a whole, we're still Kroger, Albertsons, Ahold Delhaize, Publix. These are the biggest players. Now, Amazon is fairly new to this space, as we can see with their acquisition of Whole Foods in August 2017. Now, I want to make it clear, Amazon and Walmart are actually leaders when it comes to the grocery space. It's just that the way the Planet Retail RNG database works is we take the banners that are associated with grocery, and that's why you're seeing Kroger and Albertsons as the lead. If we were to look at purely category sales, which we don't specifically track for all of these retailers, we would actually see Walmart and Amazon ahead. Now, it's interesting to note that Amazon is pushing so strongly into the grocery landscape. Their big acquisition in terms of physical stores was the Whole Foods acquisition. Now, interestingly, we've also seen the other big retailers, or e-commerce retailers specifically, across the globe investing in brick and mortar grocery locations. And this is a huge indication that the grocery brick and mortar stores will remain a very, very relevant part of any grocery landscape moving forward. And as I mentioned, JD.com and Alibaba are pioneering this push. But it's clear that these stores are not looking like your traditional grocery store or the average big box Kroger. These look different. When it comes to space allocation, 50% or more is dedicated to food service or some sort of experience. So we're going to see those center store categories that you cannot define a real experience around, or you cannot create some sort of attraction for. We're going to see those categories shift online, while the perimeter categories, such as produce, the deli, and a lot of those service-oriented, or even, as we can see in the HEMA market, the hand picking of your own crab, those are the elements that are going to remain in store and that are going to help drive store traffic, and what we call elements of the store of the future. Now, as we look at what these future stores look like, it's important to remember that that this can also go in reverse. So it's not just that Amazon and JD.com and Alibaba and the pure play players of the world are pushing into brick and mortar, but it's also very, very important to note that the top brick and mortar players are also pushing into e-commerce in a big way. So when we take a look at the overall online grocery landscape in the US, this means the food and beverage or grocery related sales for these companies that are moving through online. So when we take Kroger and Ahold Delhaize, this means ClickList and Peapod respectively. For Walmart, this doesn't mean Walmart.com's entire business, but it more focuses on their online grocery banner that they've pushed heavily with their their grocery pickup and their home, and now really pushing into home delivery. As you can see, Amazon is a clear dominant leader in this category right now. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of the center store CPG goods that they can sell through their platform that would count as grocery. So while this number does include the Prime Fresh and pantry numbers, as well as some of the Whole Food delivery, or excuse me, this number does not include Whole Foods because it's prior to their acquisition. But while it does include their Prime Fresh and their Prime Pantry pieces, it's important to note that a majority of this $7.3 billion sales we saw in 2017 is actually coming from the 1P site with a lot of the CPGs that are a little more shelf stable and consumers trust an online player to deliver. So as you can see, there's a significant investment and push behind online grocery. But the question is, why are retailers making this push? And the answer to that is because of the changing preferences of the on-demand consumer. So the on-demand consumer is changing everything about how we shop. For example, millennials are much more likely compared to the previous generation to shop online, largely because, one, they are a much more tech-savvy generation. And when it comes to demanding, and when it comes to convenience and transparency and a seamless experience, millennials have much, much greater expectations around these compared to previous generations. So as millennials continue to age, and as they age into peak consumption, we're actually now seeing when millennials start to settle down and now they're shopping for families, they have dependents, we're actually seeing that more of these family trips will lead to more online grocery and help accelerate that shift. So I want to just conclude with how the steep and the larger drivers of the macro society are impacting this online grocery landscape. So as I just mentioned, millennials are reaching age of starting families and hitting peak consumption. This is going to be one of the biggest drivers behind online grocery share, expecting to more than double over the next 5 years. Let me say that again. It's going to double over the next 5 years, and that is a conservative estimate. We could see it going from 3% all the way to 9% if everything broke the right way. So what's important to note about this is that we're going to see the biggest shift in shelf-stable items. In those categories that I mentioned, Amazon wins so well because there's less of a barrier for consumers. Secondly, we're going to see a slower shift in the perimeter and perishable items, and these items will actually take more space in store because those are the categories that will drive the brick and mortar trips. Secondly, as I mentioned, consumers' expectations are dramatically increasing when it comes to convenience. So when we talk about the expanding impact of convenience, one thing to note is that proximity retail will become less important as e-commerce is more developed. When it becomes just as fast for you to order something on your phone and have it get to your house versus you get up off the couch, walk to a store, and then bring the goods back, people are going to eventually opt for e-commerce. They're going to pick the more frictionless experience. So retailers must redefine their value propositions around speed and convenience, in addition to how it was previously largely focused on price. And now we can even say that in addition to price and proximity, going forward, speed, convenience, and the amount of effort that needs to go into a trip needs to be considered when defining your value proposition. Lastly, we have increasing rates of digital adoption. With every generation, we're seeing a more and more tech-savvy generation. We're seeing groups that are basically being raised on an iPhone, learning to type before they're learning to write. So it's important to note that physical stores and online need to be married together to create a seamless experience. We live in a digital age with more touch points than have ever existed before, and that trend is only going to continue. So as we have more and more information about customers and their behavior, whether online or in store, retailers need to leverage this to create a truly integrated and seamless experience. So when we talk about an integrated experience, what does that mean? So at the basic level, early on, we saw retailers such as Amazon deploy pickup points in physical locations that would allow for an expansion of their range and would also drive traffic for that partner retailer. Now we're seeing retailers and brands take steps to full integration. The closest example we have to this is Amazon, working with Whole Foods and pioneering their Amazon Go store. This is the closest thing we have to a fully integrated retail ecosystem and experience. But it's important to note, even as Amazon gets closer to create, Amazon and Walmart for that matter, get much closer to creating this truly integrated experience, online grocery as a whole still has some pitfalls. So it's important to note the relative strengths and weaknesses of online grocery relative to the in-store experience. So the strengths, the speed of basket building, ease of finding items, and even the pricing, which Mark had mentioned early on, the dynamic pricing ability of an online store is significantly higher than what you can change, what the turnover you can achieve in store when you have to physically change a lot of these labels or promotions. But when it comes to weaknesses, there are still a lot of barriers to online grocery. Delivery options, fees, and timing, as well as quality on delivery, are still the biggest. And those two can largely get tied in together as fulfillment. And eventually, fulfillment is what will ultimately decide the winners and losers in online grocery. The other two pieces, inspiration and out of stocks and substitution, are actually some that are not necessarily the biggest pain points, but they are the aspects in which online grocery differs, and its differences from the in-store trip most affect the consumer. So when it comes to inspiration, it's hard to recreate walking into a grocery store, smelling all the amazing smells, seeing the incredible food, and being inspired to buy or cook a new item. When it comes to out of stocks and substitutions, it is harder to trust an associate or an Instacart picker or basically anyone else to choose the right produce, to substitute the right out of stock juice for the correct replacement. So understanding those dynamics are very difficult, but again, fulfillment is the big piece, and that's also because fulfillment is so tied to profitability. So when we talk about fulfillment and profitability, the next natural step is click and collect. So click and collect has been one of the key focuses that we've seen in online grocery. Retailers such as Walmart and Kroger have really dedicated a huge portion of their capital expenditure towards expanding their click and collect programs. It's important to note that click and collect was more popular, not even necessarily because it was easier for consumers, but I do think it is less of a jump from the traditional store than a home delivery setup. But the bigger piece is actually from a profitability standpoint. Click and collect is significantly easier and more profitable than online grocery, purely because you don't have the shipping cost. the biggest cost you have in click and collect is the fulfillment piece. Whereas anyone in online grocery or in e-commerce will tell you the last mile solution and that last mile problem of delivery has historically been the biggest cost. And as we note that click and collect and these sort of fulfillment options are becoming more popular, it's important to note that they're going to take more space in store. You need area to store the picked bags. You need different associates to then take up space as they go around the store picking up these items, or you need to have a warehouse that does it for you. And lastly, you will specifically have space for the consumer to come pick up your good. So overall, yes, fulfillment will be a boon, but it will take more space in store and retailers will have to adjust accordingly. Now, the next step from click and collect is home delivery. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of profitability issues around home delivery, especially when it comes to grocery, but third-party players are making it much more possible. So Instacart, for example, has made it possible for a retailer like Albertsons to fix its generally variable fulfillment and delivery costs. It also allows Instacart to develop capabilities while working with a variety of players that they can then integrate to each of these retailers, whether it comes to transparency, substitution ability. Instacart makes it more likely to roll out a bundle of capabilities to a retailer with one deal, as opposed to a retailer going through the very labor-intensive and iterative process of building out their own in-house home delivery system with all of the same capabilities that would come with an Instacart or a Shipt. I also think Postmates is a bit of a sleeper here because, yes, they had been known in this sphere, but their partnership with Walmart could really push them out and make them one of the bigger players given the size of Walmart's sales and its store footprint. I also think it's important to note that we will start to see some of these retailers push for exclusive partnerships so that they can gain market share. One of the best examples is Amazon's Prime Now and Whole Foods. It is unlikely that the Prime Now service will still be extended to other grocers beyond Whole Foods. Similarly, it's very important to see what happens with Target and Shipt following its acquisition and whether Shipt will withdraw or take away its services from certain areas. Interestingly, it's also very, very important to note that we're going to see this online grocery piece with Instacart and these other third-party players play a larger role in the store's actual website. So one of the ones we've seen this in is Walmart, most specifically, in which they have completely reorganized their site experience around grocery. And it's not just Walmart. Costco has made a huge push to make Instacart and their same-day delivery powered by Instacart a clear promotion and with lots of marketing throughout their site to make it a clear focus going forward. And as retailers keep organizing their websites around these players, around these grocery services, it's important to note it's not that grocery is now the sole focus of Walmart as an organization, but that when it comes to online aspects, they want to at least make the consumer very aware of this option and this ability. So as we talk about the website and how you can tailor your website for the future online grocery players, building out the grocery ecosystem is something we're largely seeing in the infancy stages, but is going to be super important moving forward. So as I mentioned, it's hard to create inspiration when it comes to online grocery. It's hard to create impulse. It's hard to recreate a lot of the elements in store that lead to additional sales, even if it's not planned on it, but even if it's not planned that way by the consumer. So I think the best example is these shoppable recipes that Kroger, Walmart, and Amazon are all integrating with their platforms. So to simplify it as much as possible, you would go to Tasty on BuzzFeed and you would see a menu. You would then click a button that would add all of the ingredients into your Walmart online grocery basket, And then you would have the option for delivery if it's available in your market, or you would or just pick up and pick it up at the store at your convenience to select the window. And I think this is really where we're going to see a lot of investment going forward, because eventually we're going to see that you need to create a reason to retain customers on your platform. So customer retention is going to be just as important as customer acquisition, as millennials with less and less loyalty become the primary decision makers in households of large families. So when we talk about bridging this online piece and recreating the store experience online, I think it's really interesting when we see retailers go the opposite way. So Amazon and Whole Foods, for example, they're actually bringing elements from the online experience in store. And it's a great example of how bringing these online benefits to the brick and mortar locations can benefit not only the online platform, but also the actual physical store. Because we're seeing that these Prime deals have actually led to an increase in Whole Foods store traffic. Not only that, but when you go to a Whole Foods and so on Prime Day, Amazon and Whole Foods offered, basically if you spent $10 at Whole Foods, you would then get a free $10 to spend on Amazon for Prime members. And what this does is it not only gets people in store because they want that deal for later on Amazon, but it then makes it very clear makes a very clear bridge between buying your goods in Whole Foods and then leveraging that to benefit your Amazon Prime account. Another option is I have friends that personally joined Prime because of the Whole Foods benefits. So this is a huge way for Amazon to boost their already massive Prime subscription audience, meaning you're now expanding. You can potentially expand this 100 million plus group to all of the existing Whole Foods or loyal Whole Foods customers as well. So we've talked a lot about online grocery and how that needs to be married with the physical store. It's also important to note that the growth of e-commerce is not going to help the store in general. The physical store is under threat. So when it comes to a lot of the drivers we've talked about, the growth of the e-commerce, millennials changing the way they want to spend money, so generally on experience and not things, as well as rapidly changing consumer expectations, retailers will have to react in one or many of these three ways. So store closures. As I mentioned earlier, we expect more retailers to net close stores than open stores over the next 5 years. And the stores that we do expect them to open, we expect them to be in a smaller format because it'll be more of a channel and operational diversification. As grocery becomes more crowded, retailers need to look for other areas in which they can establish expertise and drive store traffic. Currently, this has largely been within healthcare. So Amazon's push, as well as the now scrapped merger between Albertsons and Rite Aid. But when we look at these small format stores, it's important to note that that a lot of these players are moving into smaller formats to get closer to the end customer. So it allows for easier fulfillment if that delivery distance goes from 20 miles to half a mile. But the biggest implication here is what happens to in-store space. So when you go to these smaller stores, we actually see that a lot of the perimeter and fresh categories are still taking up a lot of space. The center store, however, and a lot of the shelf-stable goods is significantly smaller in these stores than in a traditional big box player. And a lot of that is because these stores are not trying to fulfill the same shopping occasions that those stores were. So understanding how these small format stores will be rolled out and understanding what assortment is going to be key in these stores is very important for brands in order for them to properly map out their future scenario. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, channel diversification and store closures are two ways that retailers can get involved, but the biggest by far is going to come from investment in store of the future initiatives. So when we look at R&G's store of the future, it is a significantly less transactional store than we are historically accustomed to. So when we take a look at experiential and social elements, these are actually largely in the trial phase. So we'll see them at flagship stores or maybe one-off locations, but we won't expect to see this rolled out or scaled for a few years. Realistically, 3 to 5 years out until these can be expected to be everyday store elements. On the other hand, the majority of investment currently is going into frictionless and the frictionless and curated elements of the store of the future. Frictionless largely being tied to online grocery, meaning the fulfillment and the just seamlessness of experience that is often produced when it comes to building out data. Curation is also informed by online grocery and in-store data, as retailers can try to mirror one another or tailor online versus in-store to promote different products or categories. So when we take a look at frictionless and what that digital store and the future with all this new technology looks like, it's important to note that most of it is still going to be around fulfillment, and that center store digital integration is still in the early phases. That being said, you can already see how having expansive online operations will be a massive benefit to that center store integration in the time to come. So Alibaba and JD.com do a great job of showing us what this future could look like within this space. And I think the Endless Aisle by Carrefour is a perfect demonstration about how having a viable and strong online operation can really enhance your in-store experience as well. And it's important to note that integration for these areas, especially the perimeter categories, is going to be slow because the perimeter is still driving a lot of people into the store. But when it comes to the center store is going to move online much faster, and that is potentially where we could see more of these digital integration elements coming into play earlier. And I think it's important to note that there's a huge profitability and store piece to this. So as retailers have more goods shift online, they need to make their stores more profitable because online operations are just inherently less profitable than in-store. One strategy for these retailers is to promote their private label. So a lot of online grocers have taken the opportunity to use their platform to specifically promote their own brand products. The two most relevant examples that come to mind, Kroger recently launched Kroger Ship, a standalone pure play grocery service similar to a Peapod type model in 4 major markets. This model, they have specifically said, will promote some of their private goods a little bit more, which one, not only builds the legitimacy of Kroger's private label, it also allows Kroger to protect the margin slightly of an inherently less profitable shopping trip. Ahold, for a long time, through its aforementioned Peapod service, has also promoted its private label goods, specifically by even limiting the number of competing national brand SKUs and lowering the amount of choice. And again, as retailers make these decisions, so much of these online decisions will greatly impact in-store space. So when it comes to driving people inside and how you can use the space in your store to drive people inside, a lot of retailers are turning it to dining options and trying to best understand what are the elements of a store that are going to get our consumers to come in to walk through those doors. So Kroger has launched a purely food service format as basically a standalone restaurant, Kitchen 1883. And I think this is a great example of how the future of food can be much more focused on experience and specifically this food service piece. Additionally, these dining experiences and other inspirational elements within the store and social elements are going to take up a lot of space. food service takes up a significant amount of space compared to most experiential elements. So it's going to be key to understand which categories are going to be phased out in favor of these elements. Some categories will no longer exist in store, or only the bare minimum staples of those categories, because if you can't create an experience or an attraction around a product, it's not going to stay in store. And it's important to note that of these categories, the traditional grocery items will, meaning the ones that drive people in stores, such as fresh and prepared foods, will still be relevant. And those will be much, much less likely to lose store space compared to the center store stable goods. So overall, just an overall message when it comes to the impact on the physical store, a lot of the online grocery piece, as sales move online, we're going to see more space in the store dedicated not to products and to the traditional grocery assortment, but to experiences and the services that will continue to drive store traffic. And this is going to have a profound effect on marketing, merchandising, and overall strategic decisions. So to wrap things up, I just want to talk about some of the big takeaways. Number one, I cannot say this enough. Online grocery share is about to explode when it comes to e-commerce maturation. Other categories went through a slower adoption because we didn't have as many previous categories to set the blueprint for how this category will move online. We also have consumers that are even more digitally native than we had when consumer electronics or books were starting to shift online. The next piece is which fulfillment model is going to win. And even though click and collect is currently the dominant fulfillment model and accounts for the vast majority of grocery sales, or online grocery sales, especially when it comes to traditional grocery players, home delivery will become increasingly relevant as grocers and non-traditional food relevant players develop more last mile solutions. So Amazon and Walmart doubling down on grocery means that the two retailers with the biggest or with the most expansive infrastructures for delivering goods to consumers' houses are now really focusing on developing that grocery infrastructure. So as we see the home delivery infrastructure build up and the cost doesn't have to be relayed to the consumer as much as it currently is, meaning it becomes cheaper, I believe we will see much more adoption of home delivery, and it will take a lot of share from click and collect. And then lastly, as consumers increasingly demand a truly omni-channel experience, the retailers that are best positioned to win are those with a truly integrated brick and mortar and e-commerce operation. So it's important for us to understand that you need to marry both of these elements seamlessly and have them feed into one another going forward. It's not enough to just have both, but understand that you can take learnings from your e-commerce operation and apply that to your in-store layout or merchandising. Similarly, you can take store point of sale data and have that inform how you tailor your online assortment. So the clear players going forward are going to have to win by optimizing both their physical locations as well as their online operations. I just want to thank everyone for listening to our presentation, and I want to turn it over back to Mark for any questions that the audience may have.
Well, thanks, Mark, for your partnership in this area and certainly working close with GMDC and our Education Council to really deepen the insights and introduce new and sometimes provocative ideas to our viewers. We do have several questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get to those now. Let me go ahead and check some of our Q&A monitors. Mark, we have a viewer that's asking, since there are additional costs of picking for click and collect and home delivering, is it net profitable when cannibalization of in-store sales are taken into account? So let me preface this. I was over shopping at several and doing store tours at several grocery stores in the Northeast this past few months. And I stopped some of those personal shoppers and asked them, how much does it cost for you to do all of this? And some people were picking $150, $200 orders, and it costs $4.99 for the consumer to do this. And some of these employers are being paid $10, $12, maybe $15 an hour to pick this. So from my aspect, it certainly is not profitable, but it's a loyalty program to allow and to continue to have shoppers continue to be banner loyal to that group. Now, some of those personal shoppers are becoming more and more familiarized with some of the preferences of those shoppers. So obviously that gets quicker and quicker. But what's the Planet Retail perspective on this as far as profitability of the click and collect and how that process takes place?
Yeah, that's a great point, Mark, that it is inherently less profitable, as you mentioned, because you do have to pay for labor that the consumer would previously do. The picking and fulfilling aspect in store is now shifting from the consumer's burden to the retailer's burden. So you're absolutely right that it is harder to be profitable in that space, but a lot of retailers have actually claimed that they are reaching profitability with their online operations. So Kroger has mentioned that there's actually a ramp up period to their click and collect, that within about 8 months to a year and a half, you can expect that click and collect operation and that store trip for a click and collect to not be as profitable as, or they claim to be as profitable as an in-store trip. I would imagine it's not as profitable, but they are reaching profitability. The other piece is that this is where third-party players come into play. So they give retailers a very fixed cost. So when it comes to understanding how much your fulfillment costs go in, it's much easier to budget and prepare going forward. But generally, yes, it will be less profitable, and the key to reaching profitability is scale. And that's why the only players we've seen getting close to this profitability are the ones that are the closest to being nationwide. So Kroger, Amazon, and Instacart. And those are the biggest pieces. I also would not be surprised if Shipt reaches profitability fairly soon.
Great, very understandable. Next question, Mark, who is best positioned to win in online grocery right now? And again, from Planet Retail perspective.
Yeah, and that's generally a tough one. When it comes to looking at this landscape, as I mentioned, the players who have already achieved scale across a national footprint are definitely best positioned. Amazon, with its massive infrastructure when it comes to just e-commerce and home delivery, let alone when it comes to online grocery, gives them such a huge advantage compared to other players like Kroger and Walmart. I think if I had to bet on two, it would be Amazon and Walmart.
So while I appreciate the economies of scale, Mark, what about if we were to see some small leading regional grocery players partner with some of these larger delivery businesses who are working with other large chains? Can they not tack into some of those efficiencies?
So that's a great point. And I think they definitely can get some of that. And I believe that's why you're seeing small players will never develop in-house services. And even for click and collect, they'll outsource it because they know these other third-party services are learning from all the data and operations that they're seeing from other players.
We have another question that just popped in. If a supermarket partners with a delivery company such as Instacart, how easy is it for them to move to another provider or an in-house provider in the future?
So given what we've seen in certain retailers shifting their partnerships, it doesn't seem like it's a dramatically profound impact. When it comes down to it, the reason why I don't think it's that hard to switch is because a lot of these models are still inherently the same. Instacart versus Shipt versus Postmates still involve having a personal shopper go into the physical store, picking the item and driving it home. Whether the cost and those implications are different, that will obviously impact your decision. But generally, I would imagine it's very simple to do a one-for-one switch. And we've noticed as Walmart abandoned its trials with Uber and Lyft to then almost immediately partner with Postmates. And similarly, Sprouts left Prime Now to then start working with their in-house as well as working with Instacart.
I was going to suggest that's more of a technical switch as opposed to a personal switch, so meaning that the consumer ordering through an omni-channel platform may see a slight interface difference, but at the end of the day, the grocery store is still responsible for training its associates to get the orders right and make sure that it's personalized and they understand how firm or how soft those bananas need to be based on the preferences of that person who's ordering. One more question, Mark. Are there any technological advancements that could further accelerate the growth of online grocery? And what I hear, especially from GMDC's retail focus group, quite often our retailers are asking us inside our ecosystem, when will this end? When will the online shift stop? I think that's hard to tell. I think right now we're seeing the e-com at around 10%. We're seeing some of it slow. We've seen Amazon Fresh pull out of some markets over the past year and a half. So I think the question begs an answer. When is it going to stop? Are we seeing a pause right now and it accelerate in the future? Are we truly seeing some type of slowdown where shoppers eventually will say, do you know what? That's enough for now. I still have to go into the store. The store is still relevant for many categories, but certain categories, I'm done with shopping online. I think I've got everything I need from that area. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's always a tricky one, is understanding when online operations will start to slow down or when that transition is no longer in its explosion period. And I think you have to take it category by category, and specifically for grocery, I would say we have barely scratched the surface of that online shift. We are only at 3% share when it's easy to imagine it going up to 10 or 15%. That being said, there is an end, as you mentioned. So I don't think we're never going to see it be 100% online grocery. And if I were to guess, I would say that my personal estimate, and I can check with other members of our team to get more of a consensus view, but I would imagine that over 50% of grocery sales, even 10 to 20 years from now, will still be conducted in store.
Well, it's interesting that 10% that I quoted you is somewhere where I've read that's total global sales. So that's not just grocery, that's also non-foods. And we see a number of non-food categories, over the next 3 years. I've read your research as well. We see certain categories completely leaving the store by 2020 and even by 2025. And that's what we're trying to help our retailer constituents understanding what those categories are. But at the same time, some categories are still growing inside the center store and the perimeter that are non-foods. So I think that's an interesting Infocast or conversation to have, certainly in the future.
Yes, and Planet Retail R&G is actively working on this topic. So we're actually hoping to publish in the upcoming weeks, and I can send out a more specific date once I confirm that with our team, about the shift online categories are having. So publishing something around, here is where the current share is, here's where we expect it to be in 5 years, and here are the drivers behind that.
That's great.
So
that would align perfectly with some of the new white papers we have coming out this fall. So let's continue this discussion, and I would love to be able to publicize that, certainly to our members behind the firewall, to say here's the numbers, because we've leveraged the Planet Retail R&G research in our center store research that took place about 6 or 8 months ago, and we're socializing the data from 2016 as well as 2017. So it would be great comparison and contrast to see where those are going now.
Yep.
Good. Well, thanks, Mark. That certainly ends our Infocast, but we appreciate your hosting and your insights that you've given to our members and our audience today. Thank you.
Thank you.
If this is your first time experiencing a GMDC Infocast, I'd like to make sure that you're aware that this session and all previous Infocast events can be viewed on the archive tab on gmdcconnect.org, along with a schedule to register for future Infocasts. Planet Retail R&G has a few more actually coming up this fall, and we've added a few more recently this week that we want to make sure that you take aware of and understand that we're going deeper into omnichannel strategies to help retailers understand new mix strategies as well as assortments between physical and virtual. That said, I'd like to encourage you to get involved with GMDC and become a member. Today's Infocast is just a small sample of what members have access to. GMDC is a business ecosystem that helps you connect, collaborate, create, and enable commerce in both general merchandise and health, beauty, wellness. For more information, feel free to contact me at markm@gmdc.org. I'd love to help you find opportunities to get your company exposed to high-profile executives and decision makers. Thanks for joining us. We hope the rest of your week is as productive as this Infocast has been. Take care.